We're going to look at a letter that was written from this province in present-day Turkey, Bithynia Pontus, by a governor named Pliny, or Pliny the Younger. And he's writing a letter to the Roman Emperor Trajan. And so you see Trajan on the left there. We have a depiction of Pliny there on the right. Now, there's considerable distance between present-day Turkey and Rome. That distance, of course, can be covered, in a day by plane. At this time, we're talking about something that will take, many weeks for a letter to get from present-day Turkey to Rome. And so we're talking about a process that certainly by modern standards takes a considerable amount of time. And there are a lot of letters between Pliny and Trajan that have been collected. You can read them now. And so many letters between Pliny the Younger and the Emperor Trajan survive. And this fact alone tells us something about the organizational skills of the Roman Empire, that, that these letters can be transported back and forth and that they survive. These letters, however they're contained, they change hands. You have a reliable system of transportation of these letters. The letters survive the transit from Turkey to Rome, from Rome back to Turkey. And not only do they survive the transit, but they survive, period, and we can read them now. That gives us a little bit of information about the Roman Empire. The empire's interest in preserving the letters of Roman leaders, the empire's interest in having writing materials, having material that you can write on that will stand, that will survive time, that will survive travel, etc. So this fact alone, that we have these letters that are going back and forth and that they survive, that tells us something about the organizational skills, the organizational interests of the Roman Empire. Well, what we're going to do is look at this letter from Pliny the Younger to Trajan, which is clearly a Roman document from the early 2nd century, about the year 110, about the year 111, right? And then we're going to put it next to some early Christian documents. And we're going to do what historians do. Historians collect documents, they collect artifacts, and then they ask the question, what do these artifacts tell me? What do these documents say? And they put them together. And from this collection of documents, this collection of artifacts, this collection of images, then historians come up with plausible stories about the past. Not stories in the sense of just making stuff up, right? But using evidence to pull stories about the past together. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to put a Roman document next to early Christian documents and see what can we learn about, the situation or a situation in the Roman Empire in the 1st century and then the early 2nd century. And so Pliny's letter to Trajan begins this way. It's my practice, Lord, to refer to you all matters concerning which I am in doubt, right? So, Pliny is going to have significant room to move, to make his own decisions in his own part of the empire. We've said this before, there's no way the Roman emperor can micromanage the whole empire. So Pliny has freedom of movement, but he has some questions. And so this shows us that although the emperor is not micromanaging the emperor does have general supervision of the empire. And so the governor sends Trajan letters saying, I've got a problem, I'm not sure what to do, so I'm writing to you to ask. And so Pliny says, I have never before participated in trials of Christians, so I don't know what offenses are to be punished or investigated or to what extent. And so Pliny wants to know, exactly do I go about, punishing Christians, dealing with, from the Roman perspective, this problem of Christianity. All right, so Pliny says, I have followed the following procedure. I interrogated them, that is, Christians, or accused Christians, as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Now, we may have mentioned this before, but what we see here with Pliny is, he's willing to execute people and he's willing to punish people, but there has to be a reason. And notice that he says, I interrogate them again and again and again. And he says 3 times, I interrogated them. So that's what a Roman document says. Now let's look at a Christian document. The Christian document in this case is the Gospel of Luke. And here we have a trial. So Pliny's talking about sort of a trial. Here we have a trial that's described, the trial of Jesus. Jesus is on trial in front of Pilate, the Roman who's in charge of that part of the empire. And notice that it says, for the third time, Pilate spoke to them, that is, to the people accusing Jesus. They're saying he should be crucified. And Pilate says, why? What crime has this man committed? I've found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore, I'll have him punished and then release him. And the thing I want to point out here is just the similarity that in the case of Pliny and in the case of Pilate, you have there's a repetition, right? You want to find out, what has happened. So Pliny says, I'll interrogate, 1, 2, 3 times. Pilate asks once, asks twice, asks a third time. And what we see here is there's not an eagerness in the cases described here to punish. Okay, so that tells us something about how the Roman Empire operates. And you always want to be careful because there might be evidence out there that tells a different story. But we put these two documents together, one Roman, one early Christian, and we say, okay, well, we do know that the Romans will come down very hard on Christians at certain times and places. But these documents suggest that, at least in some cases, there was not an eagerness to do so, right? That we're going to come back and question and re-question, etc. Okay? Pliny's letter, up at the top, says, there were others possessed of the same folly, that is, referring to Christianity, but because they were Roman citizens, I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. All right? And so Pliny makes a distinction. He says there are some who are Christians or are accused of Christianity. They're not citizens, and so, I deal with them one way. But then those who are Christians get treated in a different way. I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. So there's a distinction. There's an implied distinction between Roman citizens and non-citizens. That's the Roman document. Let's come to the Christian document, Acts 22. Acts is basically a history of earliest Christianity. I won't read this long passage here. Of course, you can pause the video and read it. But basically, what we have described is that Paul has gotten into trouble with local authorities, right? And he's being flogged. He's being whipped and interrogated. And at some point, Paul says, is it legal? Well, let's look at what he says. Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? Paul is a citizen, right? Paul is a Roman citizen. And so, quite understandably, he plays the citizen card. He's being flogged, he's being whipped, right? And Paul says, is this how a citizen is supposed to be treated? Notice that reflects what we see in Pliny's letter. Pliny's letter indicates there's a distinction. There's citizens and there are non-citizens. Citizens have special rights that non-citizens don't have. Paul seems to be saying the same thing. If he's not a citizen, there's not much he can do. But he says, hey, I'm a citizen. Is this how you're supposed to be treating me? And then, Acts goes on to tell us that the Romans respond and say, oh, this isn't how we're supposed to be treating a Roman citizen. So we put these documents together and, we get a sense of, okay, well, if nothing else, we see that citizens have certain rights that non-citizens don't. On the same theme, we move forward a little bit in this early Christian document called the Book of Acts. And Paul says, I'm standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I've not done anything wrong to the Jewish leaders. He's being accused, just as Jesus was, he's being accused by local leaders of, stirring up trouble with his teaching. He says, if I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I don't refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So this is Paul, all right, appealing to Caesar. After Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. And Paul can do that because he's a citizen. It's his citizenship, which gives him the power to appeal to Caesar. Look at the quote above from Pliny. Pliny says, some were Roman citizens, and for these I signed an order for them to be transferred to Rome. So there's that similarity, right? And so the historian notices, oh, the Roman document says this about, what happens with those who are in the class of citizen. We see the early Christian document sort of showing us how this plays out, how a person says, hey, I'm a citizen, I have certain rights, and he appeals to Caesar, and to Caesar he is sent. You can look up easily what are some of the distinctions, what are some of the benefits that come with being a citizen. Here's a list, and it's not a complete list, but if you look down at the very bottom, it says no Roman citizen could be tortured, whipped, or receive the death penalty unless found guilty of treason, right? So that we go back to that passage where Paul is being whipped, and Paul's like, hey, is this how you're supposed to be treating a Roman citizen? And if you read that passage, the Romans respond and say, oh, we didn't know you were a citizen. If we knew you were a citizen, we wouldn't have done this, okay? So you can read the list here, but there's there are definite benefits that come with being a citizen in the Roman Empire. And Paul, although he does end up being executed, he at least has the ability to appeal to Rome, and he is sent to Rome. And by tradition, that's where Paul dies. Pliny's letter goes on. He says, those who denied that they had been Christians when they invoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose together with statues of the gods, and they also cursed Christ. Okay, these, Pliny says, I thought should be discharged, because the Christians come in, they show reverence for the image of Caesar, they show reverence for the gods. And we've discussed in the past that for the Romans, this is very important, that the gods should be shown reverence, because if the gods aren't shown reverence, then they're going to get upset and they're going to take it out on Rome, right? And remember, as the Roman Empire does fall apart in the late 300s, the early 400s, one of the allegations made is that, the Roman Empire is falling apart because of all the Christians, and the Christians are not revering the gods are angry, and that's why all of this trouble is coming to us. And St. Augustine responds to that in his book, The City of God. Okay, but this is how you demonstrate that you're not a Christian, because no Christian, no committed, devoted Christian is going to bow before a statue of Caesar. No committed Christian is going to show reverence for the gods, right? So that's what the Roman document says. Then we come to an early Christian document, the Revelation of John. And we have a passage in this document where we're reading about persecution. People are being persecuted. Christians are being persecuted. And how is this persecution described? Well, let's look at it. And we've seen this passage before, but let's look at it again. There's this being called the beast. We won't go into what that is right now. But the beast was given power to wage war against God's holy people, that's the Christians, and to conquer them. So, the beast has power. The Roman Empire had power. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, nation. Sounds like an empire. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. Well, the Roman Empire, that's the world as we know it. And they're all required, everybody within the empire is required to show reverence for Caesar. That's one of the ways, that's one of the common things, that's one of the things people in the Roman Empire have in common. It's a very diverse empire, hundreds of languages, many, many, many different religions. One of the things we have that holds us together, one of the common experiences we have, is showing reverence for Caesar, right? Reverence for Caesar. So all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast. We're not going to get into the details of this, but here's the key point. So that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. So there's the key idea. An image of the beast comes out. Okay? Now, Christians have had different interpretations through the centuries about what the beast is. Okay? Let's just focus on this. Where historically speaking, where does this image come from? Or this idea come from? That an image is brought out, or that people go to an image, or they're brought to an image, they refuse to worship the image, and they are killed. Well, isn't that implied in Pliny's letter? Pliny says, well, I'll find out if you're a Christian or not. Here comes an image of Caesar. Show reverence. Burn some incense. Pour out some wine in front of this image. If the Christian says no, then from the Roman point of view, that looks like treason, and those are grounds for execution. So here we see a similarity. We see the Roman describing this. We bring the image, the Christian says no. Okay, this is grounds for execution. That's the implication of what's said here. In the Christian document, here comes the image. People say no, and they're executed for not bowing, for not showing reverence to the image. Okay, so I hope you can see how these documents complement one another, right? They go together. They tell us something about what was going on in the world at that time. Pliny says that the Christians were accustomed to meet on a fixed day. He describes, it's interesting, one of the descriptions we have of an early Christian meeting comes just from a Roman governor who had apparently done some investigating. And here's what he found: that the Christians were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn, so they're meeting very early in the morning. The fixed day was likely Sunday, the day that the early Christians associate with, the resurrection of Jesus, so probably a Sunday. They sing a hymn, right? They bind themselves to an oath not to do crime, not to commit fraud, not to commit theft, not to commit adultery, not to falsify their trust, right? It sounds kind of weird, like they're taking an oath to be good people, to be, good workers, to be trustworthy people. It's kind of a weird passage because you think, oh, well, Pliny realizes these people are taking an oath to be good people, right? But that's not why they're being persecuted. They're not being persecuted because they're identified as bad people in the sense that they're stealing or, causing trouble in the market. They're being persecuted because they're considered traitors, because they won't show reverence for Caesar, they won't show reverence to the gods. And as an additional problem, as we've discussed, these Christians have themselves made a god of a crucified non-citizen. Well, let's go on and see what Pliny says. When this meeting was over, it was their custom to depart and then to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food, right? So it's interesting, he describes these early Christian meetings. He says that they have this first meeting, what we might call a church service, a worship service, then they depart, and then they come back for a meal, right? Now it's very interesting because, of course, a meal, the sharing of bread and wine, is a theme that comes up a lot in early Christian writing. It comes up in the Gospels at what's called the Lord's Supper. It shows up in an early Christian writing called the Didache, which we haven't said anything about, but what's called the Didache is an early Christian writing that describes an early Christian worship service and what's called the Eucharist, communion, the Lord's Supper. That's described. And then in early Christian images, we can use the phrase early Christian art, but I don't think the early Christians who put these images up, I don't think they're really thinking of art as we think of it. Remember, in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, most people are illiterate, right? And so for most Christians, most early Christians can't read the letters of Paul. They can hear the letters of Paul, and then they'll look at images, and the images will remind them of stories in the Gospels. They'll remind them of Christian stories. And as we look at these early Christian images, then we see, such as we see here, sort of an emphasis on the sharing of food. So it's interesting, once again, Pliny says that the early Christians will sort of have a worship service, and then they'll meet to share a meal. And we see this meal illustrated, and we see this meal discussed in early Christian documents. One of the places you can go is the early Christian document, a letter from Paul to the church at a place called Corinth. The first of those letters, there are two, the first of the two letters, chapter 11. And you can see that Paul says a little bit about this here. So once again, we have the Roman document, and then we have the early Christian documents, not just the written documents such as 1 Corinthians 11, but the images as well, where Pliny identifies that this meal that the Christians come together for is pretty important, right? I mean, otherwise, why does he mention it? So this seems to be a basic thing for the early Christians. And then we go to Christian literature itself. Was it a basic thing for them? Yes, it was. And so these two things fit together pretty nicely. Pliny says, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. Now, so he's torturing these poor young female slaves. Other translations say maid servants, right? He's torturing them to get information. So that's kind of terrible, right? But I'm reluctant to say let's put torture aside, but let's put that aside and focus on something else. And that is that these are female slaves. Other translations say maid servants. At the very least, these are young women with very humble jobs, right? Important jobs, but very humble jobs. And this translation says slaves, okay? So let's go with this translation. These young women are slaves. That is, according to the Roman world, in the Roman world, these young women are slaves. But look at what they are among the Christians. Deaconesses, right? Let me fast forward. Look at this document here at the top. When she who is being baptized has come up from the water, this is an early Christian document talking about baptism. So you have a woman who's been baptized, she comes up out of the water. It says, let the deaconess receive her and teach and instruct her how the seal of baptism ought to be kept. For this cause we say that the ministry of a woman deacon is especially needful and important. A woman deacon is needful and important, and a woman deacon is teaching. A woman deacon has a leadership position within the early church, right? Let's go back. 2 deaconesses within the Christian community, but what are they outside? Slaves. And we come to this interesting question that early Christians are persecuted, not every day and not in every place. The persecutions break out at different times and places in the Roman Empire, okay? But Christianity is persecuted. And as we've discussed, some of the ideas that Christians have will strike a lot of Romans as bizarre and disgusting, all right? Remember, Tacitus refers to the Christians as disgusting, right? And one of the things that makes them seem disgusting is their embrace of the cross, this terrible symbol of the cross. So why does Christianity grow? I mean, Christianity grows rapidly. And in the first centuries, it grows from persuasion, by word of mouth. It's not something that grows, as a result of warfare, as a result of conquest. Christianity grows in the first centuries as a result of persuasion. Why does Christianity grow when it's persecuted and when it has ideas that strike so many people as awful? And I think one of the reasons we see here in this letter from Pliny. Just think about it, strictly in terms of psychology. You're a slave in Rome. You're a slave, and what power do you have? What leadership do you have as a slave? But I can join this movement, this Christian movement, and within the Christian movement, then I can be a leader. So in my work life, I'm a slave, but in the Christian community, I can be a deaconess. I can be a leader. And just purely at the level of psychology, it's not hard to understand why people who, in their own worlds, don't have leadership opportunities, don't have opportunities to be persuasive, don't have opportunities really to make a difference in other people's lives, it makes sense why they might be attracted to a movement that says, hey, we don't care if you're a slave, come on in. Now, it's very interesting is that this passage below illustrates what is suggested in Trajan's letter. It's interesting, Trajan wants information about the early church. So who does he go to? He goes to 2 female slaves who are leaders within the church, right? Well, what's interesting is when you read early Christian documents, of course, when we think of the key leaders, Jesus, Peter, Paul, men obviously. But what might be interesting for you to do is to start at the very beginning of Matthew, the very beginning of the New Testament, this collection of Christian documents. Start at the very beginning of Matthew and then go all the way through to the end of the book of Revelation, right? With one question. What are the women doing? What are women doing? And what we find is that in early Christian literature, women are playing very, very, very important roles, right? We think of Mary, for example, obviously playing a very important role. Pliny seems to suggest that women, even of very humble means, even female slaves within the Christian community, are playing important roles. And we see this illustrated at the end of Paul's letter to the Christian community at Rome, because in the last chapter, chapter 16, he names a lot of people. So, greet this person, greet this person, greet this person. And what you see is that a lot of the folks he's greeting are women. So let's look at it. I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church, right? Look at what he says. She has been a patron of many and of myself. Phoebe has been a patron. So he's traveling around, he's doing a lot of work, but he needs resources and he needs help. And he's saying Phoebe has played this very important role of helping me in my work. He says, greet Prisca and Aquila. This is a couple, Prisca and Aquila. What's very interesting, though, is that Paul mentions Prisca first, which is very unusual in the Roman world to give the wife's name before the husband, right? This indicates that Prisca was a person of influence. And notice he refers to Prisca and Aquila equally as my fellow workers who risked their necks for my life, right? He goes on, greet Mary, right? Greet Junia, right? So women are playing very important roles. And we see this in early Christian literature. You see this referred to in Pliny's letter, right? It's suggested. I want to learn about this, so I've tortured slaves who within the Christian community are deaconesses, that is, people in leadership positions. We've looked at the quote from the top. We see these early Christian images where women are playing important roles. On the left, we have a reminder of a story of a woman who had a sickness for many, many years, and she comes and touches the hem of Jesus' garment, thinking, if I can just touch even the hem of his robe, then I can be healed. And so that story is there. And she plays an important role in that early Christian story. In the middle, we have a depiction of women there in a Christian meeting. We know it's a Christian meeting because the person in the middle is doing this posture, which is sort of the posture of prayer, right? But here we have women there. And if you look at early Christian imagery, we have women there. So women are playing a very important role, and that seems to be indicated in Pliny's letter, indicated in this early Christian writing. And then down below from Galatians, we mentioned Paul's letter to the church at Galatia. Paul says this, that within the Christian community, just skipping down to the third line, within the Christian community, there isn't Jew or Greek, there isn't slave or free, there isn't male or female, all are one in Christ Jesus. Now, Paul is not saying that when you come into the Christian community, you stop being a male or female. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that out in the world, of course, women and men have their separate roles. Out in the world, of course, slaves and free, separate roles. Out in the world, Greeks and non-Greeks, may have different things to do. But within the community, there's equality. That doesn't mean we're all doing exactly the same thing, and it doesn't mean there aren't people with designated positions. But within the Christian community, we're equal. And so if I'm a slave and you're a non-slave, well, out in the street, that makes a difference. But within the church, we're equal, right? We're equal. And we see that play out in this letter again. I mean, this passage from Pliny's letter to me is the most interesting. That we have slaves, Roman slaves, who within the Christian community are leaders. And that seems to, this observation of Pliny's, or this recognition of Pliny's that slaves outside are leaders within, that seems to suggest that there really is something to what Paul said, that within the Christian community, there's not slave or free. Within the Christian community, we are all one, we're all equal. And so it's very interesting to put these documents next to each other. We'll end up with a couple images here. Up top there, I've indicated to you, if you see this, an ancient imagery, then it's almost certainly an early Christian image, right? It's the image of prayer. Another, image that's still with us, another symbol for Christianity. You've got the dove with the branch, the olive branch in its mouth. Also, you have what's called the Chi-Rho. If you look at the word Christos in Greek there, the first two letters, what looks to us like an X, in English we make into a CH. What looks like a P in English is an R. So Christos, and that symbol there that looks like an X and a P, it's what's called the Chi and the Rho. It's the first two letters in Christ's name in Greek. That's a symbol that we still see, and that's a very ancient symbol. And the woman, or the person in the middle there with the posture of prayer, is a woman. And then down below we have a Christian grave marker for Firmia Victora, who lived to be 65 years old, and she is making her journey from this world to the celestial kingdom. All right. So who knows? I don't know who Firmia Victora was, but maybe she was one of these folks who, you know, in the Roman world, maybe didn't have much status, maybe didn't have many opportunities to be influential, to be a leader, but within the early Christian community, maybe she could have some influence and leadership there. I think this is one of the things that helps to account for the rapid growth of Christianity. Christianity was open to everyone, unlike a lot of Roman religions, which were kind of exclusive or for a particular group or for a particular interest, right? Christianity is open to everyone, slaves, free, Jew, Greek, men, women. Within the community, all are one. I think that's going to be attractive to a lot of people. So it's very interesting, just to wrap up, put that letter of Pliny next to excerpts from early Christian documents, and we get a sense for how this movement operated, right? And it's interesting to put these things side by side and to see how they complement each other.